When the first Harley-Davidson rolled into Jake Martinez's driveway at 6:47 a.m., he thought it was a mistake. When the second followed, his stomach tightened. By the 10th, he knew his life had split cleanly into a before and an after. By the time the rumble stopped, 95 motorcycles lined the narrow street outside his failing garage, engines idling like a restrained storm. Chrome caught the early desert sun. Leather vests filled the air. And every single man on those bikes was watching the same thing. Him. Jake stood just inside his open bay door, one hand gripping a grease-stained wrench he hadn't realized he was holding. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. And he hadn't stopped replaying the moment from the night before, the moment that had brought them all here. Because 12 hours earlier, Jake Martinez had done something no mechanic was supposed to do. He had told a powerful man that the most expensive wheelchair money could buy was hurting his daughter. And worse, he had touched it without permission. Now, as the last engine cut off and the sudden silence pressed against his ears, Jake understood exactly what this looked like from the outside. A broke mechanic, a crumbling garage on the edge of Mesa, Arizona, and a line of bikers whose reputation made people cross the street without thinking twice. This wasn't a misunderstanding, this was judgment. The man at the front of the formation dismounted slowly, taller than the others, broader, his movements calm in a way that didn't ask for respect, it assumed it. They called him Reaper. Jake had learned that name the night before. Reaper stepped forward, boots crunching softly on gravel, and stopped 10 feet from the garage entrance. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Jake felt the weight of 94 men settle behind him like a wall. If you were watching this from the outside, you might assume Jake was afraid of the bikers. That wasn't quite true. Jake had been afraid before. 8 years earlier in Afghanistan, he'd learned what real fear felt like when a convoy stalled under a sun that melted thought itself, when a single loose bolt could turn a routine drive into a funeral. He'd learned fear in Kandahar, in places where hesitation killed faster than bullets. This was different. This wasn't fear of violence. This was fear of being wrong. Because if Jake was wrong, then the choice he made, the choice to speak up, to contradict engineers and doctors, and a father who had spent $40,000 trying to protect his child, wouldn't just cost him his garage, it would mean he had caused harm where he meant to stop it. And that was something he didn't know how to survive. Reaper's voice finally cut through the quiet. "Where is it?" Jake swallowed. His mouth was dry. "Inside," he said. He stepped back, and the men followed. The garage was small, too small for this many people. Cracked concrete floors, peeling paint, tools organized with military precision against walls that had seen better decades. And in the center of it all, under harsh fluorescent light, sat the wheelchair. It looked impressive at first glance. Sleek titanium frame, polished joints, digital controls. The kind of equipment brochures bragged about. The kind designed by people with degrees on their walls and patents on their desks. Reaper circled it once, slowly. His brothers stayed silent, watching. "This is what you worked on," he said. Jake nodded. "Yes. You fixed the noise?" "I could have," Jake replied, then paused. But that wasn't the real problem. A murmur rippled through the room, not anger yet, but interest. The sound of men who understood machines enough to know when someone was either very confident or very stupid. Reaper stopped moving. "You told me last night," he said evenly, "that my daughter's chair wasn't broken. Yes, and that the people who built it, engineers, specialists, doctors, missed something. Yes." Reaper looked at him then. Really looked at him. "And you," he said, "caught it in under a minute." Jake didn't answer right away, because this was the moment everything balanced on. "I didn't catch it because I'm smarter," Jake said carefully. "I caught it because I listened to machines differently." That earned him a few raised eyebrows. Jake took a breath. "I spent 8 years keeping military vehicles alive in places where good enough got people killed," he continued. "I learned that sometimes a machine isn't failing, it's fighting the person using it." He gestured gently toward the chair. This one was doing that. Silence again. Then, from the doorway, a voice spoke up. "Dad?" "Sophie." She was 16, bright eyes, brown hair pulled back, wearing a faded band t-shirt that had nothing to do with biker clubs or fear or reputations, just a kid who wanted to exist without pain. Reaper turned instantly, all edge gone from his posture as he moved to her side. Jake watched that shift and understood something most people never would. This wasn't about power. This was about a father who had done everything right and was terrified he still wasn't enough. Sophie looked between the men, then at Jake. "You said it wasn't my fault," she said quietly. Jake nodded. "It isn't." The garage felt smaller suddenly, more fragile, because this wasn't about 95 bikers anymore. It was about whether one man had the courage to admit the system could be wrong, and whether another man was willing to hear it. Reaper turned back to Jake. "You get one chance," he said. "Explain it." Jake stepped forward and began to tell the truth. Jake didn't start by talking about the wheelchair. He started with the desert. "I learned this in Afghanistan," he said, his voice steady even though his leg had begun to ache from standing too long. "Out there, machines don't get second chances." Reaper watched him without blinking. Jake gestured toward the back wall of the garage where a single photograph was pinned above the workbench. 5 soldiers in desert camouflage, dust in their hair, sunburned faces squinting at the camera. Jake was younger in the picture, both legs straight, smiling like a man who hadn't yet learned how heavy survival could feel. 3 of them didn't make it home, Jake continued. "I did. Not because I was braver, not because I was luckier, because I listened." He turned back to the wheelchair. "In Kandahar, we had a Humvee everyone signed off on. Suspension looked fine, numbers were in spec. On paper, it was perfect." He paused, but it didn't feel right. Sophie leaned forward slightly in her chair, listening. "I felt it in the way the frame flexed when weight shifted, the way the tires pulled just a hair to the left. Everyone told me I was overthinking it, said we were behind schedule, said we didn't have time." Jake swallowed. "I forced a rebuild anyway." Reaper's jaw tightened. 3 days later, Jake said, "That Humvee hit an IED. And because the suspension was rebuilt correctly, every man inside walked away. The garage was silent again, but it was a different silence now. Less threatening, more focused. That's when I learned something," Jake said. "A machine can be expensive, advanced, approved by experts, and still be wrong for the person using it." He moved closer to Sophie's chair, careful, respectful. He didn't touch it yet. "When you rolled in yesterday," he said, looking at Sophie now, "I wasn't listening for a squeak. I was watching you." Sophie blinked. "Me? Yes," Jake said. "Your shoulders. The way you brace every time you stop. The way your back never fully relaxes." Reaper shifted slightly. "You didn't complain," Jake continued, "which told me something else. You'd already been taught not to." Sophie's fingers curled around the armrest. "They said it was normal," she said quietly, "that my body just had to adjust." Jake nodded once. "That's what they always say when the system doesn't want to admit it missed something." He finally knelt, lowering himself slowly, his injured leg protesting. He placed one hand on the frame, not adjusting, not fixing, just indicating. "The center of gravity is wrong," he said. "The battery pack sits too far forward. That means your spine is compensating all day, every day. Not because you're weak, because the chair is forcing you to." Sophie's eyes widened slightly, not in fear but recognition. "That's why it hurts more at night," she whispered. "Why I'm exhausted even when I don't go anywhere." Jake met her gaze. "Exactly." Reaper stepped closer now. "You're telling me the best engineers money could buy built this wrong." "I'm telling you," Jake replied carefully, "they built it for specifications, not for her." "That landed," Jake continued, more quietly now. "They measured you once, in a clinic, fresh, sitting straight, trying your best." He looked at Sophie gently. "They didn't measure you after 6 hours, or when your muscles were tired, or when pain made you adapt in ways that slowly hurt you." Sophie's throat worked as she swallowed. "I thought it was just me," she said. "Like, maybe I wasn't trying hard enough." Something in Reaper's expression cracked just for a moment. Jake saw it and pressed on. knowing this was the truth they all needed. "That's the most dangerous part," he said. "When the machine hurts the person, and the person blames themselves." He stood with effort, bracing briefly on the workbench. "I could have fixed the squeak," Jake said, "charged you, sent you on your way, and you'd still be hurting 6 months from now, maybe a year, maybe longer." Reaper exhaled slowly through his nose. "So what are you saying?" he asked. Jake didn't hesitate. "I'm saying I can rebuild this chair so it works with her body instead of against it." "And if you're wrong?" Reaper asked. Jake nodded once. "Then I won't touch it." That answer surprised them. "I won't experiment on your daughter," Jake said. "I won't guess. I won't promise miracles. I'll change only what I know is wrong." He looked directly at Sophie. "And you'll tell me if something feels off, even if you think you're being difficult." Sophie hesitated, then nodded. Reaper studied both of them for a long moment. 94 bikers watched in complete silence. "How long?" Reaper asked. 24 hours, Jake replied. "To do it right, not to rush, not to impress anyone." "And the cost?" Jake shook his head. "Not today." That earned him a few murmurs. Reaper's voice dropped. "You understand what you're risking?" Jake did. He understood that if he failed, this garage, this fragile, barely surviving place would not survive the morning. But he also understood something else. If he stayed silent, Sophie would keep hurting. And that, to him, was the greater failure. Reaper finally spoke. "You get your 24 hours, he said. "If you're right, my daughter walks out of here with less pain than she came in with." He leaned closer. "If you're wrong." Jake nodded. "I understand." Reaper straightened and turned to Sophie. "You trust him?" he asked. Sophie looked at Jake. Really looked at him. "He's the first person who didn't tell me to get used to it," she said. Reaper closed his eyes briefly, then opened them. "Do it," he said. And just like that, Jake Martinez was alone in his garage with a $40,000 wheelchair. And 24 hours to prove that listening mattered more than credentials. The garage felt different once they were gone. The rumble of motorcycles faded into the distance, leaving behind a silence so complete Jake could hear the hum of the fluorescent lights above him. The desert night pressed against the thin metal walls, warm and unmoving, as if even the air was waiting to see what he would do next. 24 hours. Jake stood alone in the center of the shop, staring at the wheelchair like it might suddenly explain itself if he waited long enough. He checked the clock on the wall. 7:12 p.m. He rolled his shoulders once, slow and deliberate, the way he used to before working on vehicles that couldn't afford mistakes. Then he reached up and pulled the garage door down halfway, not to close the world out, but to quiet it. This wasn't about bikers anymore. This was about a girl who had learned to live with pain because adults with authority told her she had to. Jake pulled on a fresh pair of gloves and began the only way he knew how, by breaking everything down. He started with the seat. The outer shell came off easily, too easily for something meant to support a human spine. He set each screw aside in neat rows, muscle memory guiding his hands. He didn't rush. Rushing was how people got hurt. As he lifted the cushion free, he felt it resistance, not mechanical human. Something thin and brittle pressed between foam and frame. Jake froze. He peeled back the fabric carefully, fingers slowing as if he were diffusing a device instead of dismantling a chair. Tucked deep inside the seat cushion, folded so tightly it had softened with time, was a piece of paper, just one. He unfolded it. The handwriting was small, careful, the kind that tries not to take up space. "Someone please help. It hurts." Jake didn't move. The words sat there in his palm, impossibly light and unbearably heavy at the same time. 2 sentences, that was all Sophie had allowed herself. No blame, no anger. Just pain quiet enough to be ignored by anyone who wasn't looking for it. Jake lowered himself onto the stool beside the workbench, the paper still in his hand. His chest tightened in a way he didn't have language for. He'd seen notes like this before, not written down but carried. In the army, they showed up as silences, as men who stopped reporting discomfort because everyone else was fine, as soldiers who blamed their own weakness when equipment failed them. He pinned the note above the workbench, right next to the old photo of his unit. Then he got back to work. The deeper he went, the worse it got. The battery pack, heavier than it needed to be, sat forward and slightly left, forcing constant compensation. The frame alignment was within tolerance on paper, but in real-world use it created drag that Sophie's shoulders had been fighting every single day. Jake exhaled through his teeth. This wasn't negligence, this was arrogance. Someone had decided they knew better than the person living in the machine. He checked the time again, 9:43 p.m. Jake leaned against the bench, rolling his neck to ease the tension building there. His leg throbbed now, a deep ache that reminded him of long nights in places where sleep was a luxury and mistakes were permanent. For the first time since Reaper had left, doubt crept in. What if he was wrong? What if he'd seen patterns that weren't there, projected his past onto a situation that needed different expertise? He reached for his phone. Reaper's number sat there on the screen, unmissed, uncalled. Jake imagined the words he could say. "I was mistaken. I need more time. You should take it back to the specialists. It would be safer. It would be reasonable. It would also mean folding that note back into the cushion and pretending he'd never read it." Jake locked the phone and set it face down. He didn't need to be fearless, he just needed to be honest. And honesty meant admitting something most people avoided at all costs. The system doesn't always get it right. Jake pulled a marker from the drawer and began sketching directly onto a sheet of cardboard, quick, precise lines mapping weight distribution, stress points, posture angles. Not what the chair was supposed to be, but what Sophie needed it to be. Midnight came and went. Outside, the desert cooled. Inside, Jake's hands stayed steady even as his body protested every movement. He stripped unnecessary plating, replacing it with lighter materials he'd salvaged months earlier and never thrown away because you never know. At 1:18 a.m. his knee buckled slightly as he shifted weight. He swore under his breath, gripping the bench until the pain passed. For a moment, he laughed, a quiet, humorless sound. "You're not the only one hurting," he said to the empty garage. By 2:30 a.m. the frame was rebalanced. By 3:15, the alignment finally tracked straight across the concrete floor. Jake pushed the bare frame forward with one finger. It rolled true. He closed his eyes for a moment, not in relief, but in focus. This wasn't finished, but it was possible, and that was enough to keep going. He looked again at the note pinned above the bench. "Someone please help. It hurts." "I hear you," he said quietly. Then he picked up his tools. By 4 a.m., Jake had stopped thinking in hours. Time collapsed into tasks: measure, cut, test, adjust, each movement deliberate, each decision carrying weight far heavier than the materials in his hands. The garage no longer felt like a place of business. It felt like a field hospital. He wiped sweat from his brow and stepped back from the frame, forcing himself to pause. In the army, they taught him this rule early: never trust momentum. When things start going right, that's when people stop checking their work. Jake picked up a marker and wrote 3 words on the whiteboard he usually used for invoices. Listen, balance, reduce strain, 3 principles. No more, no less. If every change didn't serve one of those, it didn't stay. He started with balance. The original design had chased sleekness, heavy components placed where they looked impressive, not where they made sense. Jake relocated weight backward in small increments, checking the center of gravity after each change. He rolled the frame across the floor again. This time, it didn't fight him. He smiled faintly. Next came strain. Jake removed a section of plating that had no functional purpose beyond aesthetics. It clattered onto the concrete with a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the garage. In its place, he fabricated a lighter support using reinforced composite he'd once salvaged from a wrecked sport bike. Not fancy, not pretty, effective. At 4:52 a.m., the garage radio crackled faintly as an old song bled through static. Jake hadn't realized it was still on. He left it that way. The noise helped him stay anchored. As the sky outside began to shift from black to deep indigo, Jake turned his attention to the controls. This part required restraint. He could make the chair hyper-responsive, but that would trade one problem for another. Precision mattered, but so did ease. Jake recalibrated sensitivity slowly, testing the joystick with the lightest pressure he could manage. Better, not perfect. He adjusted again. Better still. He glanced at the clock. 5:37 a.m., less than an hour. Jake's legs screamed as he lowered himself to the floor to test shock absorption. He felt every vibration through the frame, through his bones, comparing it instinctively to the vehicles he'd worked on years ago. Too stiff. He swapped out a component, then another. This wasn't about innovation, it was about adaptation, taking existing technology and applying it where it belonged. At 6:05 a.m., he stopped. Not because he was done, because he was tired enough to make mistakes. Jake leaned against the wall, breathing slowly, forcing his heart rate down. He stared at the wheelchair, not with pride, not with fear, but with scrutiny. "Does this help?" he asked aloud, "or does it just prove something?" The chair didn't answer. The note did. His eyes drifted to the paper above the bench. "Someone please help. It hurts." Jake pushed himself upright. "This helps," he said. He began reassembling. By the time the first light of dawn slipped through the cracks around the garage door, the wheelchair stood complete. It didn't look revolutionary. It didn't glow or hum or announce its transformation. It simply looked right. Jake ran his hands over the armrests one final time, checking their height, their angle. He adjusted the footrests by a fraction of an inch, less than most people would notice, more than Sophie's knees ever would. He stepped back. The chair waited. At 6:32 a.m., the sound returned. Engines, one, then many. Jake's chest tightened as the familiar rumble approached. Louder now, closer. He didn't move to the door. He didn't hide the chair. He sat down on the stool beside it. The garage door was already open when Reaper walked in. The bikers filled the space again, their presence as heavy as the night before, but something had shifted. They weren't here to intimidate. They were here to see. Reaper approached the chair slowly, his eyes moving over it with a focus Jake recognized. A man inspecting something that mattered. "You changed it," Reaper said. "Yes, you didn't replace it. No, you didn't call in anyone else." "No." Reaper nodded once. "Talk to me." Jake did. He explained the three principles. Not with jargon, not with ego. Just cause and effect. Weight moved here, strain reduced there. Nothing dramatic, nothing unnecessary. The bikers listened. A few nodded. One knelt to check the frame alignment. Another ran his hand along the wheelbase, testing resistance. "This track's true," someone muttered. Reaper straightened. "Bring her." The van door opened. Sophie appeared in the doorway, watching the scene with cautious eyes. Hope hovered just behind her expression, but she kept it contained, as if afraid to let it grow. Reaper helped her forward. Jake stood, his leg protesting, and stepped aside as Sophie transferred into the rebuilt chair. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Sophie inhaled sharply, her shoulders lowered, not dramatically. Not all at once, just enough. "It's different," she said. Jake waited. She placed her fingers on the joystick. The chair responded. Smooth, immediate, no strain. Sophie rolled forward a few feet, then stopped. She blinked. "That didn't hurt," she said quietly. The garage held its breath. She turned, rolled back, shifted her weight slightly, still nothing. Her eyes filled, but she didn't cry. She laughed, not loud, not wild, relieved. Reaper closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. Jake exhaled for the first time in hours. This wasn't a miracle. This was what happened when someone finally listened. The relief didn't last long. It never does. Sophie rolled back toward her father, still smiling, still testing small movements as if afraid the moment might vanish if she stopped paying attention to it. Reaper knelt in front of her, his hands steady as he checked the straps, the alignment, the position of her feet. "How does your back feel?" he asked quietly. Sophie hesitated, not because she was unsure, but because she was searching for the right word. "Like it's allowed to rest," she said finally. "Like it's not fighting me anymore." That was enough. Reaper stood slowly and turned toward Jake. The garage went quiet again, but this time the silence wasn't threatening. It was heavy with expectation. You didn't fix a squeak, Reaper said. You fixed what everyone else ignored. Jake shook his head. I fixed what was wrong. Reaper studied him for a long moment, then nodded. My daughter's been in pain for 2 years, he said. Doctors told her it was normal. Engineers told her the chair was perfect. He took a step closer, and a broke mechanic told her the truth. Jake didn't respond. Reaper's voice dropped, losing its edge. You know what that means, right? Jake hesitated. It means she hurts less. It means, Reaper corrected, you see things other people choose not to. He turned and gestured toward the bikers filling the garage. These men, he said, they know machines. They know when something's built for show instead of survival. A few nodded. You earned their respect, Reaper continued. Not because you weren't afraid, but because you didn't lie. He reached into his vest and pulled out a folded piece of paper, placing it carefully on the workbench. Jake glanced down. A list of names. Dozens of them. What's this? Jake asked. Reaper didn't answer immediately. Those are people the system forgot, he said finally. Veterans, injured, disabled. Men and women who came home with equipment that technically works and hurts them every day. Jake's chest tightened. They get told the same thing my daughter did, Reaper went on. That's normal. That's the best you'll get. Learn to live with it. Jake looked up. I'm one guy, he said. I can't fix everyone. I know, Reaper said. That's why I'm not asking you to... Jake frowned. Then what are you... I'm asking you to try... The words landed heavier than any threat. You fix what you can, Reaper continued. You tell the truth when you can't. And you don't charge people who already paid with their bodies. Jake's mind raced. He saw the bills stacked on his desk. The overdue rent notice. The garage that barely survived month to month. I can't work for free, he said quietly. I won't last. Reaper nodded. You won't be alone. He gestured again to the bikes, the men, the quiet solidarity filling the space. We supply materials, Reaper said. Tools, parts, anything you need. You supply the skill. Jake hesitated. And if I say no? He asked. Reaper didn't threaten him. That was the most unsettling part. Then my daughter still walks out of here with less pain, he said. And I respect you for what you did today. Jake looked at Sophie. She was watching him with an expression he'd come to recognize far too well, the look of someone who knew what it meant to be told their needs were inconvenient. You don't have to, she said softly. That settled it. Jake exhaled and nodded once. I'll try, he said, but I won't promise miracles. Reaper smiled just barely. Good, he said. We don't believe in miracles. We believe in showing up. He extended his hand. Jake shook it. The grip wasn't a test of strength. It was an agreement. The bikers began to move then quietly, efficiently. One rolled a toolbox forward. Another began clearing space near the back wall. No cheering, no speeches, just work. By noon, Marcus was first. He was older, grey threaded through his beard, scars visible beneath rolled sleeves. He maneuvered his wheelchair into the garage and stopped near the workbench. Wheels don't track straight, he said. Haven't for 8 years. Jake knelt, looked, listened. You compensate with your shoulders, Jake said after a moment. Marcus nodded. Destroyed them. Jake reached for his tools. By sunset, Marcus rolled out straighter than he'd come in. He stopped in the parking lot, stared ahead, then bowed his head. Jake didn't say anything. He didn't need to. That night, Jake stayed late again, not because he was afraid, but because he understood something had changed. This garage wasn't just his anymore. It was becoming a place where people came to be believed, and that came with a weight he hadn't felt since he'd taken off his uniform. By the third morning, Jake stopped counting how many hours he slept. Not because he didn't care, but because the garage no longer operated on a clock. It ran on need. The first truck arrived before sunrise, loaded with toolboxes still wrapped in plastic, welding equipment Jake had only ever seen in catalogs, proper lighting, precision instruments that didn't wobble or sputter when powered on. Reaper supervised quietly, coffee in hand, directing men with the same calm authority Jake had seen in combat zones. No shouting, no chaos, just coordination. By 8 a.m., the garage looked unfamiliar. Still cracked concrete, still desert dust clinging to everything, but now it was organized with intent, purpose. Jake stood in the middle of it, unsure whether to feel grateful or overwhelmed. "You don't have to do this," he told Reaper. Reaper glanced at him. "Yes, we do." He gestured toward the growing line outside. "They were told nobody could help," he said. "You proved that wrong. That changes things." The next veteran was younger than Marcus, mid-30s, limping even while standing still. "Tommy," he said, "walker's too short. Been killing my back for 6 years." Jake didn't ask about the injury, he never did. He adjusted the walker, measured twice, then a third time after watching Tommy take a few steps. "Stand like you normally would," Jake said. "Not like a doctor's watching." Tommy laughed a short, bitter sound and relaxed his shoulders. Jake lowered the frame 2 inches. Tommy straightened instinctively. "Oh," he breathed. "That's different." Jake nodded. "That's right." Word spread faster than Jake expected. Not through announcements or social media, but through waiting rooms, VA clinics, physical therapy offices, conversations whispered between veterans who had learned not to hope too loudly. "There's a guy in Mesa," someone would say. "He listens." By day 4, Jake couldn't keep up alone. That's when Sophie stepped in. She didn't touch tools at first. She organized, took notes, scheduled appointments, asked questions Jake hadn't thought to ask: how long someone sat before pain started, what hurt most at night, what movements they avoided without realizing it. She understood something Jake didn't. Pain teaches silence. By the end of the week, the garage had a rhythm. Jake assessed. Sophie listened. The bikers handled logistics. It shouldn't have worked. It did, but not everyone was happy. On day 5, a man in a pressed shirt and polished shoes appeared at the edge of the garage, watching from a distance. Jake noticed immediately. He always did. "Who's that?" Sophie asked quietly. "Someone who doesn't like disruption," Jake replied. The man approached later, clipboard in hand. "I'm with a medical equipment provider," he said. "We've heard some concerns." Jake wiped his hands on a rag. "Concerns about what?" "Unauthorized modifications," the man said. "Liability issues, safety standards." Jake nodded slowly. "You're worried people might get hurt," he said. "Yes," the man replied, relieved. "Exactly." Jake gestured toward a veteran testing his adjusted chair, moving smoothly, pain-free. "Then you should be worried about what was hurting them before." The man stiffened. "We follow approved protocols." Jake met his gaze. "Protocols don't feel pain." The conversation ended shortly after. That night, Jake sat alone on his stool, the garage quiet for the first time all week. The note still hung above the workbench. "Someone please help. It hurts." He realized something then. This wasn't about fixing equipment. It was about challenging a system that mistook compliance for care, and systems didn't like that. He wondered how long this would last, how long before paperwork, pressure, or politics tried to shut it down. Sophie joined him, easing herself onto a chair nearby. "You're thinking too hard again," she said. Jake smiled faintly. "That obvious?" She nodded. "You're afraid this will be taken away." He didn't deny it. "It might," she continued, "but it already mattered." Jake looked around the garage at the tools, the photos beginning to line the wall, the space filled with evidence that listening worked. "Yeah," he said, "it did." Outside, the desert sky darkened, stars beginning to pierce the fading light. For the first time since leaving the army, Jake felt something unfamiliar, not pride, responsibility, and he knew then that whatever came next, attention, resistance, or consequences, there was no going back. He'd crossed a line, and he would have to stand on the right side of it. The letter arrived on a Monday. No logo, no return address. Just thick paper, slid halfway under the garage door sometime before dawn, as if whoever delivered it didn't want to be seen. Jake found it while unlocking the door, coffee still warm in his hand. He read the first line once, then again, then he sat down. Notice of non-compliance. It wasn't a threat. It didn't need to be. It was written in the calm, clinical language of institutions that never raise their voices because they don't have to. Unauthorized modifications, unlicensed alterations, potential liability to patients and providers. The final line was underlined: cease operations immediately pending review. Jake folded the letter slowly and set it on the workbench. Outside, engines were already arriving. Veterans, bikers, people who had been told over and over that nothing more could be done. He closed his eyes for a moment. This was the moment he'd known was coming. Reaper read the letter without expression. "They're scared," he said. "They should be," Jake replied quietly. Sophie stood beside them, reading over Reaper's shoulder. Her jaw tightened, not in anger, but in recognition. "This is what they do," she said. "When something works and they don't control it." By noon, the garage was full, not with machines but with people. Marcus, Tommy, a woman with a prosthetic leg adjusted so poorly she'd stopped wearing it outside her house. A young man with spinal damage who hadn't left his apartment in months. They'd heard, "Someone always hears." "They can't shut this down," Marcus said. "Not after what you've done." Jake didn't answer right away. "They can," he said finally, "and they might." The room went quiet. Jake stood, bracing himself on the bench. "I need you to understand something," he continued. "What we're doing isn't illegal because it's harmful. It's illegal because it doesn't fit their boxes." Reaper crossed his arms. "Then we fight?" Jake shook his head. "No," he said. "We don't fight them. We outlast them." Sophie looked up. "How?" Jake took a breath. "By documenting everything. Every change, every outcome, every improvement." He gestured to the wall of photos, faces that had come through his door in pain and left standing straighter, moving easier. "They say this is unsafe," Jake said. "Then we show them results." The bikers moved without being told. Cameras appeared, clipboards, notebooks. A system began to form, not in opposition, but in response. By the end of the day, Jake had more data than he'd ever collected in his life. Pain scores before and after, range of motion, usage time, user feedback written in plain language, not clinical jargon. Sophie organized it all with ruthless efficiency. "They never ask this," she said, tapping a form. "How it feels after 6 hours, after 12, when you're tired." That night, Jake didn't sleep at the garage. He couldn't. He went home, really home, for the first time in weeks, and sat at his kitchen table, the letter spread open beside him. He thought about walking away, about returning to brake pads and oil changes, and a life small enough not to attract attention. He thought about his ex-wife's words, "One day your stubbornness will cost you everything." And then he thought about Sophie, about Marcus crying silently in the parking lot, about Tommy standing straight for the first time in 6 years, about the note, "Someone please help, it hurts." Jake folded the letter one last time. "Not this time," he said aloud. The review came faster than he expected. 3 days later, a van pulled up carrying 2 officials and a man with a badge clipped to his belt. They walked through the garage slowly, observing, asking questions that sounded neutral but weren't. Jake answered all of them. He showed them the documentation, the photos, the feedback. He didn't argue. He explained, "This isn't about defying standards," he said. "It's about updating them." One of the officials frowned. "You don't have medical credentials." "No," Jake agreed. "I have outcomes." That earned him a long look. The inspection lasted 4 hours. When they left, they didn't shut him down. They didn't approve him either. They said one thing: "We'll be in touch." That night, the garage held a quiet kind of celebration, not relief, resolve, because everyone there understood something now. This wasn't a temporary fix-it shop. It was a challenge to how help was decided and who got to decide it. Jake looked around at the people who had chosen to stand with him. "We keep going," he said, carefully, honestly. Together, no one argued. Outside, the bikes sat in neat rows under the desert sky, silent, patient, ready, and somewhere beyond Mesa, systems were beginning to notice that a small garage had stopped playing by rules that didn't serve the people inside them. The call came on a Thursday morning. Jake recognized the number immediately, not because he'd saved it, but because it had been calling him for 3 days, and he'd let it go to voicemail every time. "This time," he answered. "Mr. Martinez," the woman said. Her voice was calm, professional. "This is the Regional Review Board. We've completed our preliminary assessment." Jake leaned back against the workbench, eyes on the note still pinned above it. "I'm listening," he said. There was a pause. Papers shifting. "We're not shutting you down," she said. "Not yet." Jake closed his eyes briefly. "But," she continued, "we can't officially approve what you're doing either. It falls outside existing frameworks." Jake smiled faintly. "That doesn't surprise me. What does surprise us," she said, "are your results." She didn't say miracles. She didn't say transformation. She said results, pain reduction, improved alignment, decreased equipment returns, fewer formal complaints. "These outcomes," the woman said, "are difficult to ignore." Jake waited. "We're authorizing a limited pilot," she said. "Unofficial. Observational. You continue operating under strict documentation. No expansion. No publicity. We monitor." Jake exhaled slowly. "And if we refuse," another pause, "then we escalate," she said. "And it gets complicated." Jake looked across the garage at Sophie, who was listening intently, notebook already open. "We'll cooperate," Jake said. "On one condition." The woman hesitated. "Go on." "You listen to the people using the equipment," Jake said. "Not just the data." Silence. "Then we'll take that under advisement." The call ended. Jake set the phone down. "That wasn't a yes," Sophie said. "No," Jake replied. But it wasn't a no. The garage adapted. Documentation became ritual. Every adjustment logged, every reaction recorded. Not polished testimonials, raw language. "My shoulders don't burn anymore. I can sit longer without bracing. I don't dread leaving the house." By week 3, something unexpected happened. People started driving in from outside Mesa, not because of ads, because of stories. A mechanic in Flagstaff called Jake late one night. "I heard what you're doing. I think I see the same problems. Can you show me?" Jake hesitated. The review board's words echoed in his mind. No expansion. But Sophie looked at him, waiting. "Come by," Jake said finally. "We'll talk. They didn't franchise, they didn't brand, they shared principles. Listen, balance, reduce strain, that was it. By the end of the month, 3 other garages were quietly applying the same approach. No press, no announcements, just people helping people where the system moved too slowly." Reaper watched it unfold with a mix of pride and concern. "You're building something they can't control," he said one evening. Jake nodded. "That's what scares them. And you?" Jake considered that. "I'm scared of what happens if we stop," he said. The tension came to a head when an offer arrived, official this time. A consulting position, government-backed, secure funding. They wanted Jake to step away from the garage, to advise from a distance, to help redesign procurement standards. It was everything he'd been told to want. Safety, stability, recognition. Jake sat at the workbench long after everyone else had left. The offer letter spread open in front of him. Sophie joined him quietly. "They want you behind a desk," she said. "They want me where I can't touch the work," Jake replied. "And if you say no..." Jake looked around the garage, the tools worn smooth by use, the photos lining the wall, the people whose lives had intersected here. "Then I stay," he said, "and keep doing what works." Sophie smiled softly. "You taught me something," she said. "That real change doesn't come from permission." Jake folded the letter. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the concrete. Jake made his choice. He stayed. Change never arrives loudly, it accumulates. By the second month, Jake stopped being surprised when unfamiliar license plates lined the street outside the garage. Veterans from neighboring counties. Parents with children whose equipment had been cleared but never truly fit. Therapists who came on their lunch breaks not to supervise but to observe. No banners went up, no announcements were made, but something irreversible had begun. The review board returned this time with fewer questions and more silence. They watched, they took notes. They stood back while Sophie guided visitors through the process, explaining not the how, but the why. This isn't about replacing doctors, she told them. It's about listening longer than 15 minutes. Jake worked the way he always had, methodical, quiet, focused. He didn't argue policy. He demonstrated outcomes. And slowly, resistance turned into unease. Unease turned into curiosity. Curiosity turned into something else entirely. One afternoon, Marcus wheeled himself into the garage unannounced. He didn't say a word. He just rolled across the floor, straight as an arrow, then stopped in front of Jake. "I walked 2 blocks yesterday," he said. Jake looked up. "With help?" Marcus shook his head. "With less pain." That was how it happened. Not in leaps, not in miracles, in inches. Sophie's progress followed the same rhythm. Physical therapy twice a week, strength training that respected her limits instead of punishing them, a chair that no longer forced her spine into constant defense. Some days she improved, some days she didn't. Jake never promised more than that. Then one evening, while Jake was adjusting a suspension system, Sophie stood up behind him. Not suddenly, not dramatically. She braced herself against the workbench, steady, deliberate. "Jake," she said. He turned and froze. She was standing, not alone, not free, but upright, for 3 full seconds. Jake didn't move. He didn't speak. He didn't trust the moment enough to breathe. "I'm not walking," Sophie said quickly, as if afraid he might misunderstand. I can stand longer now." Tears welled in her eyes, not from shock, but from confirmation. "I don't hurt when I do this," she whispered. Jake swallowed hard. "That means your body finally has room," he said. She nodded. "That's what my therapist said too." They didn't tell anyone at first. They let the moment belong to itself. Weeks later, Sophie demonstrated it during therapy, standing, shifting weight, taking one assisted step, then another. Nothing viral, nothing cinematic, just real. The kind of progress that only happens when pain stops drowning effort. The day the story reached the local news, Jake didn't answer the phone. Sophie did. She stood between the camera and the workbench. "This place isn't special," she said calmly. "The way people are treated here is..." The segment aired that night. By morning, the garage was full again, not with chaos but with confirmation. The review board called once more. This time the tone was different. "We want to formalize what you've built," they said, "not take it over. Learn from it." Jake listened. He agreed to consult, but on his terms. He would stay in the garage. He would continue working hands-on, and user experience, not credentials, would be part of every evaluation. They agreed, not because they wanted to, because the evidence left them no choice. That evening, Reaper stood beside Jake as the sun set behind the bikes parked outside. "You could have taken the easy way," Reaper said. Jake nodded. "I thought about it. And?" Jake looked around the garage. At Sophie organizing files. At Marcus laughing with Tommy near the door. At the wall of photos that had grown far beyond what he'd ever expected. "I didn't survive what I survived just to be comfortable," Jake said. Reaper smiled once. "Neither did we." Sophie joined them, leaning lightly on her forearm crutches, not because she had to, but because recovery was a process, not a performance. "You know," she said, "I applied to school." Jake raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" "Biomedical engineering," she said. "I want to design equipment that doesn't forget the person inside it." Jake felt something settle in his chest. The kind of peace that only comes when suffering turns into purpose. The sign went up on a Tuesday morning. Not flashy, not dramatic, just clean lettering on a white background. Martinez Mobility Solutions. We fix what others stop listening to. Jake stood back and looked at it for a long moment, coffee cooling in his hand. The garage itself hadn't changed much, same cracked concrete, same desert dust, but everything inside it had purpose now. Systems that made sense. People who knew why they were there. Sophie rolled past him. moving carefully but confidently, a clipboard balanced on her lap. "First appointment's early," she said. "Veterans from Phoenix." Jake nodded. "I'll be ready." He always was. Months passed the way real change always does, not in headlines but in habits. Other garages began calling, quietly at first, then openly. Jake didn't license anything, didn't brand it. He taught principles: listen longer than you talk, test in real conditions, trust outcomes over authority. That was enough. By the end of the year, similar fixed days were happening in places Jake had never been. Different names, different faces, same results. The system adapted not because it wanted to, but because ignoring evidence became impossible. Procurement guidelines changed, end-user testing became mandatory. Pain reports were taken seriously for the first time in a long time. Jake didn't attend the meetings where those decisions were made. He stayed in the garage. One evening, after the last appointment left and the desert cooled into twilight, Jake sat alone on his familiar stool. His leg ached as it always did, but it didn't bother him the way it used to. Pain, he'd learned, wasn't the enemy. Being ignored was. Sophie joined him, settling onto a chair nearby. She'd grown stronger over the months. Still used mobility aids when she needed them. Still respected her limits. But she stood more often now, moved more freely. She handed Jake an envelope. "What's this?" he asked. "My acceptance letter," she said, smiling. "Biomedical engineering." Jake read it twice. "You're going to change how this stuff gets built," he said. She shook her head. "No, I'm going to change how people get listened to." Jake laughed softly. Outside, Reaper leaned against his bike, talking quietly with Marcus and Tommy. The same men who'd once come in pain now stayed to help others through it. Brotherhood had found a new purpose. Jake looked around the garage, one last time. The wall of photos, the worn tools, the note still pinned above the bench. "Someone please help. It hurts." He left it there, not as a reminder of pain, but as a reminder of what happens when someone answers. Jake had spent years thinking he was broken. A failed marriage, a failing business, a body that never fully healed. But standing there now, he understood something he hadn't before. Broken doesn't mean useless. It means you know where things fail. And that knowledge earned through suffering has value. The garage lights clicked off one by one as the sun disappeared beyond the horizon. The bikes sat quietly outside, engines cold, no longer symbols of threat but of arrival. People who had come seeking judgment and stayed to build something better. Jake locked the door and turned the sign to closed. Tomorrow it would open again, because the world would keep sending people who hurt, and as long as he could still listen, he'd keep fixing what mattered.